Beginning in the 1960s, South Korea implemented a family planning program which drastically decreased birth rates across the country. The new program was centralized around reducing overcrowding. Since then, South Korea has seen an increase in gender equality within the country caused by increases in the educational attainment and health of women. However, South Korea still suffers from a large gap in the labor force participation between men and women. As shown in the 2019 UN report on gender inequality, men had a labor force participation rating of 73.1%, while women had a labor force participation rating of only 52.9%. The gap in labor force participation rates are symbolic of alternative barriers to gender equality in South Korea. By exploring the additional barriers to equality women face, we can get a better idea of the necessary policy solutions that would aid in making South Korea a more equal place. Here, the displayed graphs show two common metrics of gauging gender equality: labor force participation and the subsequent wage gap. As we can see, women face visible barriers to gender equality in Korea. So what are those barriers? In our research, we found three main barriers to exist. First, we will show how expectations of women for childcare have negative impacts on their labor force participation. We will follow this by displaying how societal ideas involving gender responsibilities are harmful to gender equality, and conclude by explaining the harm of discrimination on the employment of women.
So to start off, our first barrier has to do with the Confucianism principles that are adopted in Korea. These started with the Chosun dynasty, which came out of power in 1910, but their belief system of Confucianism still stands very strong in society, especially from a gender equality standpoint. Confucianism has created very ingrained views of women being less capable of men, typically in leadership and in employment roles in society. It's had very negative impacts on educational attainment. It's resulted in a lot of women kind of normalizing the cheap labor, which, as we know, kind of lowers the opportunity cost of not pursuing a career at all. And on the next slide, as we see, so I cited two surveys, one amongst 1,002 young people aged between 19 and 39 in Korea, where a whopping 58.4% of the male respondents agree that it's natural for men to be favored amongst women. And I think this is a very direct result of Confucianist principles. People are conditioned to see women in subservient roles, typically starting off in the household, which makes them their views on these a bit skewed. And the second one, this table shows that in a survey of over 1,000 respondents, there were 35.8 in Taiwan. That only 35.8 agreed that men are better suited as political leaders than women, as compared to Korea, it was 52.8%, and only 25.4% of men agreed that men are better business leaders in Taiwan, while in South Korea it was a whopping 44.9%.
So the next barrier that we mentioned is childcare expectations. This barrier is when women act as the primary caretakers in the family, and ultimately marriage has negative impacts on the female labor force participation because these women tend to leave the labor force once they marry. Also, it's usually due to social pressure as opposed to their individual choice in Korea. And overall, there's been a decrease in the rate at which women exit the labor force after marriage, though it is still prominent. So another barrier we mentioned is unequal employment opportunities. And to give a little bit of background on women workers, export industrialization created more job opportunities for them, but they still experience discrimination in terms of their wages and statuses in their jobs. So women in Korea also have less of a need to expand and learn new skills, specifically in their jobs or careers. If they do have jobs, the positions tend to be stagnant and they do not really allow for much career growth, regardless of the industry they're working in. And this also means that there's almost no or a very slim chance for promotions for them. And just to give more of an idea of their work environments, they're paid low wages for long hours and potentially hazardous working conditions, especially those who are working in factories. Also, typically only young women are hired for such jobs because they're expected to leave the labor force entirely once they get married and or have children. So on the next slide, we've just included some examples of this. So the first one mentions that in 1980, the male-female wage gap was 44.5%, and it was greater than that in any other country. The second one talks about a survey that was specifically conducted in Korea in 2018, and about 72% of women claim that they experienced disadvantages in the initial recruitment stages because just solely because of their gender. And the last one talks about how Korean women only held 15.4% of the total management positions in 2019, which was the second lowest rate after Japan, according to the OECD.
Okay, so to talk about like different policy suggestions for addressing gender inequality caused by these different barriers that we've discussed, we chose to focus on the barrier caused by childcare expectations for women. And our policy suggestion to address that would be to lower the relative cost of childcare. To be more specific, this can help women by reducing the expectation that women must be available for quality childcare. So in South Korea, there is a strong emphasis on early childhood education in general, especially for children. And this creates an environment and an expectation where women are expected to stay home and care for their children like 24/7, 100%, putting in every resource they have and every like moment of attention that they have to their children and to their housework to make sure that their children grow up to be successful and are able to succeed academically once they enter either childcare or the school system. And lowering the relative cost of childcare can also allow more flexibility for women who do want to sustain a career while raising children, because if the cost of childcare is lower, both monetarily and through reducing expectation for women to provide quality childcare, i.e. like providing or maybe changing ideas so that it's perceived that childcare outside of the home is still of quality and is still an acceptable alternative to women staying home and caring for their children. Like lowering that expectation would allow women to feel less pressure to stay home and take care of their children, and would maybe encourage some women to pursue their careers long term, even if they're thinking of having children and getting married and all of that. Yeah, so even more specifically, lowering the relative cost of childcare can take many forms, but we found three main forms in our review of the literature. One of them is improving family leave policies. Two is reducing childcare costs, specifically referring to childcare services, either in facilities outside of the home or through like people coming to the home and providing tutoring or providing like babysitting, as it would be called in America. And then lastly, lowering the age of public school enrollment, which is a specific study that we cited in our citations, but basically looked at a law that lowered the entry age for public school. So to model this decision or this policy change through our labor supply decision model, we looked at how lowering these costs could change the reservation wage for women who are considering re-entering the workforce. So lowering the relative cost of childcare would essentially be like changing the price of, or the cost or the value of a woman's time at home. So if a woman started out with no hours spent in the market and every hour spent at home, their reservation wage would be like perched on the end of the graph as it is right here, with 0 hours spent in the market and all of their time spent at home. Lowering the reservation wage by lowering relative cost of childcare could encourage some women to re-enter the workforce, depending on how much the reservation wage changed. And this can be modeled through the flattening of the indifference curve, as we see in our second graph, and that can result in the movement of the optimal time like division to more hours spent in the market and less hours spent home. Yeah, so through this modeling, we can see that lowering the cost of childcare does in fact have the potential to increase labor force participation, depending on, of course, the specific reservation wages of individual women in South Korea. So some evidence that we've seen thus far for the effects of that model or that modeling that I just talked about. One study that we've looked at showed that lowering the age of enrollment for children, enrollment in public schools, can increase labor force participation. This was specifically seen in a demographic of women with low levels of own or spouse's education. So just lower educated families typically were seen, at least in this study, to have a stronger reaction to lowering the age of enrollment for children in public schools. And this law specifically was passed in 2009, and it stated that before the passing of this law, the regulations were that a child would have to be 7 or 8 years of age before they entered their first year of public school in Korea. And this law introduced the flexibility of being able to send children to school at ages 6, 7, or 8. So there's more flexibility, and children can be sent to school at a younger age. An additional study that we looked at found that previous reform efforts, this was prior to 2009, so like 2002 to 2009 was the rough time period that they gave in the study. They increased government subsidization of childcare during this period of reform efforts. And changes were observed in the following categories, as I've represented in these graphs. So the number of mothers working as regular employees increased during this time about 5 percentage points, which is not a lot, but it does show some reaction to an increased amount of spending in childcare. And also there was a change observed in the percentage of employed mothers who use childcare services. And this was a substantial change. It increased from 35% to 51%. So this shows that as the cost of childcare is lowered by government subsidization, the percentage of employed mothers increased by a large amount. So there is some reaction in the South Korean population to lowering the cost of childcare. So we can see that maybe there is some empirical evidence showing that there is a flattening of the reservation wage in practice in South Korea.
Yeah, so in conclusion, we figured out that lowering the relative cost of childcare through methods like Sophia just discussed in the previous study, like increasing access to schooling and childcare facilities, encourages mothers to remain in the workforce, and this overall will improve the gender equality in South Korea. And we looked at empirical evidence from one specific study in South Korea that supports this idea, but it's obvious that there's a ton more to be done to normalize working mothers, especially mothers with young kids in South Korea. And then, so increasing this access to high quality childcare and education will help increase the number of women who make the decision to return to work or continue to work after giving birth.
And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.